Hola, bienvenidos. Hello, welcome to this webinar organized by Esade and Repol Foundation. Today we are here to talk about the effects of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, on Europe and how Europe should respond. This is the first conversation that we are setting up, and we plan to have several other events to discuss this ongoing process of the return of industrial policy, in particular in the energy sector. So as you might know, Esade has produced a policy brief, a first policy brief on the effects of the IRA in Europe. The policy brief is now available on our webpage, esadegeo.com, on Repol Foundation's openroom.com webpage, which is a great source for energy material and energy policy and energy related information. And we'll also be sharing it on Twitter by the end of this webinar. So what is the Inflation Reduction Act? It's a huge package passed in 2022 by the United States Congress. The idea is that it will subsidize, provide support through tax credits, mostly, of about 800 billion, or perhaps even beyond 1 trillion US dollars, for the development of clean tech at large and low carbon energy sources. The initial response to that package is the Net Zero Industry Act. And we say response in the sense that given the magnitude of this program, the IRA, there are some elements that prove that there is some investments that could have come to Europe are now going to the United States. The Net Zero Industry Act, which is now being finalized in the EU legislative process, and hopefully we will see what is the outcome in a few days or weeks. Now, to discuss how Europe should react or respond to the Inflation Reduction Act, we have three great guests to discuss this matter. First of all, we have Carsten Kroes stepping in for Paula Pino from the European Commission. So we have Mr. Kroes with us, who will start the presentation or start presenting. He has studied economics and social sciences in Hamburg, Germany, Dar es Salaam, in Sweden, Vejo, and in many different places. He has had experience in Ireland as well in environmental energy and energy-related work. He has been 20 years in the European Commission. He has been negotiating team for the EU on the UN Climate Framework Convention. He has been working with India in our bilateral energy relations with India. And he is right now in charge of competitiveness of clean energy technologies, among other things, at the Director General for Energy. Mr. Kroes, thank you very much for being with us.
First of all, thank you for the nice introduction, and also thank you for inviting us, because this topic of the Inflation Reduction Act is something that is of big concern inside DG ENER, where I'm working, but also for the different services in the Commission, and we work jointly on it. So, and I think with this event we will also start to learn more, because we still try to understand. In your paper, you summarize some of the recent studies around it that we've also seen. But overall, as you indicated, it's not sure how much funding is inside. And they're also listening to the main news, a lot of questions about political stability in the US on environmental matters. And we don't need to go into it. We will know more in November and after November what about stability. What I can report about is the stability or the framework we developed in the EU, and also we can maybe call it a wake-up call that we've seen, that we heard in 2022, and maybe more got up, started to react, started our own initiatives with the Green Deal industrial plan early 2023, and I will briefly talk about it. Overall, looking on the area that the Inflation Reduction Act is addressing is clean energy technologies, a wide range from electric batteries for electric mobility to photovoltaic panels and to hydrogen. So this is a global growing market, and I think the International Energy Agency estimated it to 1.3 trillion dollars per year, and it's growing. Looking on COP28 and the global pledge on renewables and on energy efficiency, this is a stable growing market. And you can also see the Inflation Reduction Act as a US response to this growing market, and also to the need to develop an own industry. So that's something. And if you want, I can also use my slides if you want to share.
Sure.
Otherwise,
so before we jump into your slides, Mr. Krause, let me just introduce the other two speakers, so we have a view of the full panel, and we can and we are eager to listen to the Commission position and ideas about the European response. So next, we also have Johanna Lehne, who is a program lead at E3G. Johanna has vast experience in decarbonizing energy and resource intensive sectors. Her nonprofit and her work involves stakeholder engagement with industrial actors and policymakers to try to help and contribute to this transition of intensive sectors. She was previously at Chatham House, and her educational background is from University of Oxford and University College London. So thank you very much, Johanna, for being here.
Great to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Lehne. And finally, we have Angel Bautista, Director of Public Affairs and Regulatory Coordination at Repsol, although he is in charge of many more matters at Repsol, in particular, all of those that deal with the non-market environment, policy, and government. He has a graduate of business and administration. He has educational experiences at San Pablo Theo, IES and Esade, top business schools here in Spain. He has been at Repsol since 1995, previously as a quite successful investment relations officer. And right now he's in charge of, as I was saying, public affairs, where he deals with the World Economic Forum, with the International Energy Agency. He is part of the B20, which is the business group around the G20. So a lot of experience there with government and policy. So Angel, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Angel, and thank you, Esade, Geo, and the Repsol Foundation for inviting me to this awesome webinar.
Great. So the idea, and we're very proud that we can have the policymakers, we can have the third sector, and in this case, we also have corporation involved. So I foresee a very rich conversation. Mr. Krause, back to you, and let's get going with that presentation of yours. I'll be passing your slides, so please don't hesitate to instruct me when to go forward.
Thank you, and sorry for already stepping into my presentation, Angel. And
wonderful, no problem.
So if you already move to the next slide, I've already tried to introduce that the big markets that we expect on clean energy technologies. And that's something that is also partly developed on the European side, linked to our policy ambition to be climate neutral by 2050, by the ambitious Fit for 55 part. And these are objectives that we also maintained during a time when we had the energy crisis. But from the energy crisis, we also learned how important it is to develop resilience also on our supply supply chains for clean energy technologies. And now we have a big discussion on net zero industry and also how to remain competitive in the area. We investigate, and this is also partly featured in your policy briefs that you talked about, the competitiveness of different technologies. And if we move to the next slide, I will share with you some of the findings, and I think some of them are also kind of wake-up calls that we've heard. That overall, we assessed on an annual basis the clean energy technologies and their competitiveness, and we see that the market chances or the market position of them is quite well over the years. So the markets are developing fine, but we have more international competition, not only from the US, but namely from China. And when you looked in individual technologies, and here I used the PV market. You see that 60% of the global markets have already been last year controlled by China, and the market segments are, the market dominance is growing over time. And here we develop a strong also import dependency, and there is also some strategic elements that we need to address. On the other side, the IRA is something new. We don't know the full impact of it. Our evidence is growing that we collect. We will maybe learn something today from your discussion, or from our discussion. Some insights we've seen. We published in an early assessment that was published by the Commission last October. We looked recently into the data for batteries, and also we are still online for our battery capacity for 2030. We see that the production planning, and unfortunately the last line gets cut off from my slide, that the production, the development of new manufacturing capacity for the timeline after 2030 is declining. So a lot of producers or factory builders are actually holding back their investments and also investigate how well they could locate their future factories in the US, seeing that by comparison, there will be a big price advantage of batteries produced in the US thanks to the IRA compared to those produced in the EU. Moving to the next slide, please. Last year in February, the Commission President presented the first outline of the Green Deal Industrial Plan, and this summarizes also our EU reaction, or our approach to the IRA. We don't think that it's only about a competition on pulling together the bigger funds in the US or competing on this side. We saw that the competitiveness of the clean industries are depending on different parts. First, there's a strong regulatory element, and that's also a message we can draw from the Inflation Reduction Act, that a clean and simple regulatory environment is something. We can talk about the Net Zero Industry Act in this context that is trying to address it. We need to have not only more funding, but we need to have a faster and more simplified access to funding by pooling funding sources together. There we announced the STEP initiative. We see in many member states that this access to qualified labor and skills is an issue. And we have the issue of open trade, also to work with the WTO on developing our supply chains and to work with partners on climate clubs, on production partnerships with third countries. If you give me one more minute, I briefly move into the Clean Deal on the next slide, in the Clean Deal and the Net Zero Industry Act, and this is here already announced. The discussion will be hopefully finalized in the next week, when there's hopefully the final trialogue in Strasbourg. This will address the regulatory side and help to build clean manufacturing capacity in the EU, so it make it simpler, faster, and more predictable to build up net zero industries in the EU. Jumping to my next slide. Here's a short overview on what it would mean. So overall, it addresses the value chains. It looks on strategic technologies, on photovoltaics, on hydrogen, on batteries. So there's some strategic technologies, and they have been identified as those that are most crucial for reaching the 2030 targets of the EU. And for them, there's fast track permitting exercises in place that are all linked to their status and to the Net Zero Industry Act. So it focuses on the manufacturing side, and here's a short overview. Yes, thanks for using it on the net zero industry technologies. I will not go into detail here, so we can move back to it. And what are the strategic technologies, and what are also the projects that are all aiming to build up the manufacturing capacity inside the EU. Just jumping back on my last slide, and also on the this would be my last slide, going back to the four pillars. I think one element that we always see is that the EU is maintaining to work with open trade relations, and we will also work with the WTO, with our international partners, to build resilient supply chains, and also to work with our partners. And we will use also existing partnerships like the Technology Cooperation Council with the US and other forums to also link work of the Inflation Reduction Act, but also with our Net Zero Industry Act. This is something we have in mind to do, but we'll also, as we are facing European elections, some of these measures that will not only be done in this mandate, where we conclude our legislative cycle. There will be new approaches by the new Commission. I think industrial competitiveness will be a big issue, and that will also be up for the next upcoming Commission. With this, I would conclude my introductory presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Krause. Thank you for that initial presentation that sets the ground for comments. First, let's go move on to Angel Bautista and see what is the view of a major corporate regarding this package and the IRA and how the EU could or should respond. Over to you.
Thank you very much. The first thing is I want to welcome some of the comments, or all the presentation of Carsten's. Really, I believe he touches some of the problems we are facing regarding how we implement our policies, both energy transition, climate change, and industrial policies in Europe. First of all, as a citizen, we're to live better than Europe. I'm very proud of being a European citizen. But somehow I believe that regarding industrial policy, we have lost some track regarding our competition with other areas of the world, other regions. Obviously, the IRA is somehow an example of how other, I would say, free market areas are responding to this global competition. One of the, sometimes I feel a little jealous of how Americans approach this, and I know the tools and means that they have are a bit different, but I believe that it's more about how in our policies we tackle things. It's not only does they have more tools; it's that's another mentality. I'll just I don't want to focus only on the Net Zero Industrial Act. I believe that it's going to be a good tool. It lacks some things, in my opinion, but it's I believe it's going to be useful for Europe. But the first thing, Americans are focusing more, on objectives. I believe in Europe we're still very focused on the instruments. We're obsessed with what technology should be the ones that are the good ones for reaching our objectives. No. The technology should only be instruments. It should be means of getting to our objectives, and we should just let them compete and complement each other. And that's something I believe Americans understand much better. In Europe, obviously, we're suffering of the industry is suffering of very high energy prices. That it's a big problem for us, and I believe our policies are not innocent in this sense. We are full of rules that curtail supply instead of just reducing demand. We have those taxonomies which are unthinkable in the United States, which actually put a lot of barriers on financing some investments, even low carbon investments, a lot of time. So I'll just speak of the two models. In the in Europe, we have a price on carbon, which is fine. We have to internalize that cost, and then we make the consumers pay the cost of the energy transition. So we try to make expensive things that release CO2, etc., which makes energy transition expensive for the consumer. Obviously, everyone has to pay for something that is costly. That the energy transition won't go for free. But the Americans use other focus that it's the taxpayer that actually is bearing the burden of the energy transition. And through the tax credits, they make cheap the new technologies. They try to put them in the money compared to the others that are obviously more contaminating, but are more efficient in the short term. I believe that in that way we make things easier for industries and make things easier for consumers to adopt the new technologies. But we were also speaking about legal certainty. Let's be clear. Europe is very complicated. We just had closed in 2019 the objectives for the 40%, and we just reopened them in 2020. We have just the Fit for 55 are 14 different rules, 4,000 pages, not to mention other packages that are outside that. The Inflation Reduction Act is just 300 pages. It's very difficult just to understand where we are with all the very messy and very heavy regulation we have in Europe. We need to simplify that. What other things that I miss in the European regulation compared to the IRA? First, a much more broader inclusiveness or technological neutrality. Everyone's eligible. It's not a matter of subsidies. It's not a matter of the amount of subsidies. It's a matter that anyone that complies with the prerequisites of the law is eligible for the tax credit. So that's a really simple and fast approach compared to all this mess of whether I'm strategic or not, or whether I can get the subsidy or not, or whatever. I believe it's much more simple. 10 years, a 10 years horizon, when we are changing the rules every 1, 2, 3 years. Hopefully, I believe Europe is learning it's little a little about that, and I'll speak a little about the business environment. Okay, we have the tax credits. You say no, Europe has not that means, that rules, that tools to incentivize investment. That's not true. In Spain, we are paying a windfall tax for business that are losing money. And myself and this company, we promoted an amendment to that tax, saying, please, let's get a deduction on the transition energy investments. And it was not accepted. And now we are surprised that the IRA has the same approach, but we had the same opportunity here and we didn't adopt it. So I believe that it's the political willingness and the political orientation that makes things happen. So I don't want to extend myself here, but we are willing to invest in Europe. We are going to invest in Europe, in the Iberian Peninsula especially, but in other places. But in the last times, we've taken very important investment decisions in the United States, not only because of the IRA, but also thanks to the IRA. We've just acquired an onshore wind platform that obviously the IRA has helped a lot to actually accelerate our decision. I'll leave it there, and I'll leave it for the rest of the conversation, because there are other instruments like the CBAM I would like to touch base also afterwards. But having said that, thank you to the Commission, because I believe the Net Zero Industrial Act, I believe, has some things that I don't like, but I believe in general it's going to be a very good instrument to actually ease things in Europe.
Thank you, Angel Bautista, Director of Public Affairs and Regulatory Coordination at Repsol. So let's move on to Johanna Lene, who is from E3G, and she will give us a think tank nonprofit perspective.
Thank you, Angel. It's great to be in this conversation, and there's a lot already to unpack from what Carsten and Angel talked about. So I thought I would touch on three main areas in my remarks. First of all, starting with the US Inflation Reduction Act and kind of taking stock on what we've seen to date, where are we in terms of the spending, and were the kind of initial fears from the EU side about investment and production capacity moving to the US warranted? Then looking at the EU response to date and reflections around the kind of tangled politics that we see around EU industrial policy, and finally looking at where we can go from here in terms of the next EU strategic agenda and as we're moving into a new political cycle. So on the US Inflation Reduction Act, of course, the first caveat is to note that obviously it's still early days and it's hard to kind of say where we're going with this. But there has been some initial analysis looking at how funds are being dispersed, the kind of investments we're seeing. And we've all seen those kind of amazing figures coming out about the kind of explosion of funding that exists right now, explosion of spending on factory construction, announced investments in clean tech alone last autumn had already amounted to $300 billion. If you look at just 1 month last year, there were 200 billions invested in manufacturing construction. So a great picture in some ways, but there has been some really interesting reporting just recently about the fact that the rollout has actually been fairly slow, and that in particular the Biden administration is disappointed that they cannot celebrate the successes of the Inflation Reduction Act as soon as they would like to in terms of electoral gains next year, for example. So there is a lot of reporting that manufacturing output hasn't actually risen yet. Of course, there's going to be a lag. You know, you commit dollars here. You say you're going to build a factory. It's going to take a while before that factory is actually built, and you see that manufacturing output increase. But there have been more worrying signs as well that subsidies just aren't being dispersed, that delivery is just not happening. There's a couple things around state capacity, a lack of know-how about actually delivering things, a lack of government staff. There are some complaints that there are certain aspects of accessing certain tax credits that are overly bureaucratic, which is ironic because we always accuse the EU side of things about being too bureaucratic. There's often this comparison of funding and saying actually there's a similar amount of subsidies and funding available in the EU context, but it's harder to access. But it seems that in the US side of things, we're also running into some of these issues. And of course, lots of aspects cropping up around permitting issues and actually consenting various projects happening on a local level, which again are a very similar set of issues that we face in the EU around actually rolling out and delivering these types of projects at speed. So this just to kind of clarify a little bit of where we are in this comparison, and where it's sometimes really hard to compare apples and oranges, but the reality is that actually both the EU and the US are facing some of the similar issues around how you actually do industrial policy at scale at the moment. Another element I wanted to bring to the table is that there has been quite interesting analysis, including from E3G, on just how Europe is being affected to date by the US Inflation Reduction Act. We put out a report last autumn by my colleague Max Grunig, who's based in our DC office, that found that EU companies have so far made about 4% of the total announcements under the US IRA. So there are European companies that are definitely benefiting from this. In comparison to South Korea, Japan, and China, EU companies are lagging behind, but there is definitely a story to be told about a kind of bigger pie and European companies also benefiting. I've also found some anecdotal stuff when we talk to industries in the Europe, in particular in Germany, very compelling around the fact that with all of these factories being built in the US, it's very hard to build a US factory without actually leaning on European equipment or German engineering expertise. So you have a lot of companies, including small Mittelstand companies in Germany, that are actually seeing a huge boon from the US IRA. So again, just trying to bring some nuance to that discussion of the US versus Europe and where we're ending up on this. Some reflections on the EU response to date. We of course, heard from Carsten about the Net Zero Industry Act and everything that's involved in there. Some reflections from Angel already about sort of some of the tensions around where we get to. It's a strong signal in some senses. I also would question how much it makes sense to focus on kind of lists of strategic technologies, but there is a strong signal being sent there. At the same time, I would say that even as co-legislators are putting the finishing touches on the Net Zero Industry Act as we speak, there is a growing recognition that the EU will need to take another run at putting forward a coherent industrial policy. And the biggest criticism that has obviously been brought to bear with the Net Zero Industry Act is around STEP and the lack of common funding that exists currently for EU industrial policy. A real concern that exists around fragmentation of the single market, the fact that we're leaning mostly on flexibility clarity around state aid and what that really means for which member states can benefit from this transition. We still really have a fundamental ideological divide between member states on whether we're doing too much or too little on this front. And obviously the big debate and the big kind of impasse on what you can do on the fiscal side of things. So I would celebrate the Green Deal Industrial Plan and Net Zero Industry Act as a kind of a needed signal and a very a quick kind of fix to try and address the immediate concerns. But we have a much bigger structural issue that we know in the long run will require another attempt at a wider spread industrial policy with more time, with less of that legislative timeline being too short, which is the problem that we faced last year. So what does that mean looking forward in terms of the next strategic agenda? There's a couple areas that already sort of came up in my remarks that are clear that we will need to tackle from an EU side of things. That problem of common financing, it is the biggest issue that needs to be tackled. It's going to be crucial if Europe's going to compete in terms of investment on a scale that really works with regards to the US and China. But obviously it is the big problem that is locked in the kind of fiscal debates, and we're going to see where we end up with the next EU budget and what happens with the Recovery and Resilience Facility and how those funds are dispersed. But beyond just the kind of fiscal and the funding side of things, there are a whole bunch of other areas that still fall under the bracket of industrial policy and where the EU can make progress without resolving the fiscal debate. Here I would point to governance and coordination of industrial policy. There's a lot more knowledge and understanding of our value chains in Europe that we need to really understand what parts of supply chains have a comparative advantage in Europe, where we should be making those investments. So that coordination, which the Commission always does really well, but around understanding what joint strategies on industrial policy could look like between member states is key. There's a piece around regulatory power where maybe I'll contrast to the comments we heard from Angel previously about we're hearing a lot from businesses at the moment about the regulatory burden, but I would say that Europe actually has a massive strength in its regulatory power, actually leveraging and building on the power that we have within the single market and building out what we can do in terms of sending those signals of these are green products, these are green standards that we apply in our markets, and creating that pull for greener industrial production, greener energy production is a really key one that we would like to see the EU building on. So that's everything from how you build lead markets for green products and services, how you do green public procurement on a larger scale than has been done to date. Again, the US is actually moving quite actively on public procurement with its Buy Clean initiatives. So similar things in Europe would be a really powerful signal on industrial policy. And finally, electricity market reform. Angel also noted about the high electricity prices. This is a huge concern for competitiveness in Europe at the moment. It's a huge climate concern as well, as we're trying to transition to cleaner power. There's a lot that can be done here again to see better alignment of electricity market rules, build on what we've seen already in terms of electricity market design, and see more coordination of investment between different member states, and thinking about how we see that kind of green power, abundant green power, as the kind of cornerstone of EU industrial competitiveness really take hold as we move forward. But I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. This is great. Great to start the Q&A. So please, audience, those of you connected, please share your comments or questions through the chat with us, and I'll make sure to include them as much as I can in the conversation. So perhaps to start off, so we've seen some different positions, in particular regarding the regulatory strength or not of the EU, but I'd like to bring in finance that Johanna brought in so clearly. So is it so? Those that oppose more finance would say there is a next generation fund still to be spent with the RRF in there. We have member states doing some heavy lifting, and they would argue that there is a trickle down or a diffusion effect of member states spending here. In other senses, perhaps there are equivalent subsidies to certain activities, such as buying an electric vehicle in Europe versus the US. So playing the devil's advocate, do we need more funding in the EU in order to react to the IRA, as along the lines that Johanna was commenting, or do we just need to rethink the way we use that those fundings, in whether it's through competitive bidding or competitive allocation of subsidies, or whether it's multi-level administrations handing out and therefore increasing the burden and so forth. Perhaps, Karsten, you can jump in here first.
I could maybe react with two examples. So first, maybe despite the figures I gave for the battery industry, there was, I think, 2 weeks ago, a positive sign looking on the Northvolt investment in Germany, where a company that built up innovative batteries was also considering to move new production facilities to the US. There was a joint effort through EU funds, through national and also regional funds to secure the investment inside and also the jobs inside Germany. I think it was seen as a positive sign, despite of competing incentives. So here, maybe the cooperation between the European and the national level is something. But the point Johanna mentioned was also the local level. I think looking more into the case, you also saw that the local support from the mayor and people from the city council was also quite crucial to actually secure the investment on time and to also ensure the permitting. So different actors have to work together. More funding would always be welcome, but looking on the inner German debate again, and also something that reflected on the European debate, is that the head of the German Economic Advisory Council made the point that when you have a problem linked to subsidies from one side, is also an issue when you try to solve it with more subsidies on the other side. So you build up something that is more and more dependent on limited public funds. So I think that's something where an approach of looking into more dimensions beyond funding would be important. Overall, the idea of allowing a faster access and an easier combination of funds is quite useful in the current debate. Heads of states are meeting today, actually 400 meters from my office, to review our 7-year budget cycle in the Commission, the midterm financial perspectives. This is how the EU institutions plan their funding. We have to see, looking on the big needs for funds on the side of clean energy technologies, on the overall competitiveness of industry, but also on other issues like looking on the defense side, what would be the priorities given there. I think simplification is an important issue to make the access better. With the STEP initiative mentioned earlier, I think there's some ideas of bringing them together, and there may be also some future guidance we can get on industrial policy linking it to funds coming from the political level after the elections.
Thank you. Angel.
In my opinion, it's not the amount, it's the way it's used, but it's more about regulation than money. Let's put a couple of examples. One would be we're just putting on stream the first advanced biofuels plant in Spain, in southern Europe, in Spain, in Cartagena. That saves 400 the same amount of CO2 like putting 400,000 EVs on the road. The same amount that we have currently in Spain. The same. We've used zero money from subsidies. We just for getting the same savings in EVs, you have spent in Spain 4 billion. 4 billion. That plant costs around 300 million euros of investment. So, but if you ban the internal combustion engine car, you have a narrower market, and then disincentive. You don't incentivize, you disincentivize investments in Europe. So please, regulation is a must. Second, CBAM. Okay, CBAM, okay, perfect. We protect our internal market from other more relaxed regulatory environments. But if you don't give a credit, now you have the free allowances for the ETS, but if you don't get a credit for the CO2 you are paying for exporting companies, then that companies will not be able to invest in Europe if their business model is based at least in a significant manner in exporting. So regulation is again very important. It's not only just putting money in a faster money or not in this kind of innovation fund. By the way, we have several innovation funds in Repsol, so thanks to the Commission for that. But I mean, the thing is, it's more important how you regulate than just the amount of money you put. The amount of money, I believe, in Europe is right to compete with the IRA. The way that we use regulation and that money is much more important.
Johanna, over to you for a reply. In particular, this idea of whether there's enough money and the idea whether member state level expenditure would be sufficient.
Thank you. Thanks, Angel. I think this is it's a question of what you're trying to fund in the transition, what types of financing you need for that, right? So I think I would agree that, you know, when we've looked at these comparisons of the kinds of credits or incentives that exist on the consumer side, for example, for EVs, there are lots of these available in Europe at the moment in different ways, and in some ways they almost add up to the same as what we see in the US. The nature of our transition is not just, you know, electric vehicle uptake, though. It is more widespread. We're talking about sectors where we're at the very beginning of the adoption of critical technologies, where we're just around deploying kind of breakthrough innovations and seeing those plants build up. That kind of funding it is public investment. Unfortunately, it can be blended, but it is for a large part public investment. And in those contexts, when we're looking at those kinds of first example kind of breakthrough innovations and plants that are being built up, you have a massive disparity between member states in terms of who can invest in those supply chains. I think this is where the big concern comes from. Yes, you can see huge amounts of spending from France and Germany. And if you look at just the EU's temporary crisis framework, I think last year it was Germany and France alone had spent 77% of the earmarked funds. Of course, how much of that actually gets funded? But you know, we look at the single market, this core aspect of the EU project, it really calls that into question. And there is a question how much that can actually trickle down. And we have lots of capacity in lots of different member states around Europe in terms of renewables, access and capacity, in terms of access to critical raw materials, that isn't actually where our industrial heartlands are currently in Europe. So there has to be a question asked about how you make the most efficient decisions about where those industries are and how we spread those funds and how we make this a really trans-European project of this transition rather than just a German or a French transition. I think this is the fundamental aspect of what it pulls into question in terms of cohesion at the moment. So thinking of industrial policy as a form of EU cohesion policy and where that gets us, I think is really fundamental, also to the political resilience of the European Green Deal as it stands right now.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have one questions coming in from the audience. So Macarena Rea Basterra raises an important issue, perhaps mostly directed to Karsten, but open to everybody. So how is the EU right now trying to think about social acceptance of the transition in its very different forms, but in particular when it comes to permitting and social acceptance of new industrial and energy producing plants around Europe, when it comes to wind farms, when it comes to solar plants and all that, and even other elements of social acceptance as the issues we are seeing right now in France.
Maybe building also linked to Johanna's last point about the different definitions of competitiveness. So if it's the EU versus other trading blocks outside the EU, or is there also a certain coherence level inside the EU and the difference between member states? I think an important part linking it to the question on social acceptance is to level this out, to find a good approach, but social acceptance is also very much linked to the benefits of this transition. So it doesn't make sense to invest. What are the benefits? And maybe the prime interest are jobs created. So what does my region can actually benefit from this clean energy transition? Is it something that will create in a rural area a better livelihood? So is it just something that is planned somewhere, an idea coming from Brussels, but not maybe creating more problems in my side because the maybe the existing industrial facility will disappear, but I'm not sure if the new factories are built up. So I think it's an important element for this ambitious targets to show that it's creating jobs, but it's also creating welfare, and it also addresses this inner European divide between the more industrialized areas where and also areas that look for new opportunities of employment creation. So I think that is something where the EU can indicate some points, but it's also a cohesion question that's addressed also on a local level. So to ensure local buy-in, to make sure that factories or PV installations or wind parks have a local buy-in in terms of investment opportunities locally, employment creation, but also showing a benefit on the ground. I think it's very important to get the social acceptance for the clean energy transition that is ahead of us.
Angel.
Just two little comments. First, if you want social acceptance, make it as cheap and accepted and efficient as possible. And if you don't approach it with technological neutrality, inclusivity, and if you don't have an open sense of how to do the transition, it will become more expensive and socially not so accepted. And second, fair transition does not mean to subsidize the people that lose. Fair transition is trying not to lose the very good and high quality employment of our industry. Let it transform itself. Help the industry to stay in Europe. We are the most environmental efficient industry in the world. When a factory moves from Europe to Asia, we're increasing emissions in the world. So if we want to reduce emissions and we have a fair transition, please let the people transform itself. Don't kill it with taxonomies, and don't kill it with other kind of bans on certain technologies that could also, with technology, be able to complement the transition with other technologies.
Thank you, Johanna. Social acceptance.
I mean, this question hits the nail on the head. I think it's a real challenge. And as I noted, this is something that is coming up really strongly in the US context, where to some extent, the IRA was built out of a sense of how you bring social and climate elements together. And there's a very strong social justice component to the IRA and very, very strong requirements around local sort of acceptance and the jobs created, etc. Makes a lot of sense in terms of the politics that exist there at the moment, but it is also one of the challenges of actually rolling this out. I would say I very much agree with Carsten's comments about how you have to sort of sell the benefits of the transition to those local communities. There has to be a lot of discussion at local level and bringing this to bear. I think beyond the co-benefits, I think there's a really strong role also for civil society organizations, for organizations like mine who have for a long time been engaged in influencing politics on this, but haven't necessarily been so engaged on how do we talk about the climate transition in a much more compelling way to a wider public, and that kind of acceptance of what it means on your doorstep or your backyard when there is a project being planned, because this is a large scale transition that doesn't just happen kind of in our bank accounts or in terms of what we put into our cars. It is the fabric of our cities, it is the fabric of our countryside that is transitioning here, and you really need to make that compelling and understandable and clear in terms of also the aesthetics and the benefits and how that works for people on a local level. But I don't have great answers on that. It is just a huge issue that we have to tackle if we're going to move fast enough here.
Thank you. Another issue that might, I think Carsten already touched upon it, but perhaps we can start with Angel and see what he thinks, is how much should the EU take into account the World Trade Organization and its rules in its policy making? In the sense that the IRA clearly violates WTO.
Clearly violates it, and that's the issue. The big question is, should we in Europe be so respectful of the World Trade Organization, or should we change the World Trade Organization rules? I mean, should we include environmental aspects in the rules of commerce worldwide, so that we all try to level the play field, or how you say it in English? You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, if someone like the United States, are they protectionist? Yes, they are being protectionist with the IRA, but it makes a lot of sense when you know the history of the first wave of renewables in Spain, with the taxes of the Spanish people, because it was not well designed. We developed the technology of Koreans and Chinese. Uh, uh, is that a fair? Well, it's China was developing themselves, blah blah blah. But if we want social acceptance of the energy transition, we must try not to use our money just to create good jobs in other parts of the world. We'll try to create it here. So regarding the World Trade Organization, it's an organization. A lot of multilateral organizations are suffering from lack of flexibility in adapting to a new geopolitical world. I believe we should also not only think if we should be more respectful than Americans regarding the WTA, but perhaps we should think if we shouldn't change the WTA rules.
So before going to the other speakers, I understand that a global corporation like yours, Angel, like Repsol, would perhaps sacrifice part of WTO compliance and the stability in theory that provides to global commerce in exchange for a more, let's say, effective industrial policy in Europe.
I would say that as a company, we just comply with any rule. We don't trade with rules. We just comply with rules. So I won't get into that kind of discussion. What I'm saying regarding Europe is that I don't like at all. I'm a free market oriented guy, and I like to say that it's not Europe first or America first, but it's of idiots just to let others just break the rules, and you just stay like that with losing welfare for your citizens. What I'm just saying is that we need another approach, and that approach should be to include perhaps in the world trade, in the trade rules, environmental aspects that are not there, and instead of just a CBAM that probably is going to hurt a lot of exporting industries in Europe.
Okay, thank you, Johanna. So the sacrosanctness of WTO, what are your thoughts around that?
I think it's a moving target. I think that we talk a very good game, in the EU about WTO compatibility, but the reality is that the EU has taken a much more assertive stance on its trade policy in the last few years, and there has been pushing the boundaries of that in the same way as the US, honestly. So I would say that we are in a position where, definitely the world trade regime and how we think about WTO compatibility and how important it is very much shifting at the moment. I think the EU is always going to come back to the fact that it is an institution, a jurisdiction that benefits massively from interconnectedness and global trade in the multilateral system, and so it should. So it's treading a fine line between saying, where do we need to take more assertive action, where do we need to act on a unilateral basis, and how do we forge forward with that, while also trying to stay a kind of good faith actor in the multilateral space. And I think that is the right approach, given how the US is responding on this at the moment. I would also very much agree with Angel that I think obviously, if you've looked at the kind of climate and trade debates over the last couple of decades, there's consistently a concern that trade policy to some extent has held back climate action, and maybe we should be a bit less concerned about WTO compatibility and a bit more concerned about making the WTO climate compatible. But I do think also from interacting with the WTO Secretariat, the communities around that there is a conversation about that tension and that shift, and a kind of openness to considering new approaches. It is just a huge beast to move. You have obviously a total how you actually get agreement in those spaces is a real challenge. And so it's been fascinating to see how the EU and the US have stepped out of those contexts, have thought about what they can do on a bilateral and a plurilateral basis to move things forward. But I think eventually always bringing that back to how it can be a global system is still important, especially for developing country partners who ultimately need to be able to fall back on how they can have trade that they can benefit from in this transition, which is a key part that we need to keep part of this discussion.
Thanks. Karsten, over to you in case you have.
No, I think Johanna already gave the outlines from the EU side. Of course, we are a big supporter of open trade and of the multilateral setting of the WTO, and the colleagues in DG Trade are working hard to, and also in DG Climate, work hard to link the ambitious climate targets also with the WTO agenda in a better way. But maybe some points made by Johanna to deepen a bit is also that we not only work in the multilateral setting. I think we also bring in the energy and climate target forward in our free trade agreements. So we think we have currently about 46 compared to the US and others. And we are kind of leading. They're more developing, and we also have different cooperation fora. I think with the US, we have the Technology and Cooperation Council, where we discuss issues on energy, but also on digitalization and other issues where there's already established forums that could be deepened to also align certain incentive regimes in the future, but it's outside of my remit. Also, Antje already mentioned the phase end of the CBAM. I think the CBAM is now helping on internal markets, but it's obvious to see how the link towards exporting markets where you're active could be addressed. So that's something for future further development. But at least the first step has been done. There was also announcement at COP28 around the climate clubs, and I think this will also be a vehicle to discuss on those standards with international partners. And we also have energy and climate agreements more bilateral with countries where we address those issues. And there's sort of things are moving on a lower level than the WTO, and there are also opportunities we could harvest there without moving into long and exhaustive multilateral negotiations.
Thanks. So perhaps to finish off, Carsten, I know the Commission is finishing its current cycle soon, and you're wrapping things up. But what do you think will be, or what are the thoughts regarding next steps, next policy that might happen in this field following once the Net Zero Industry Act is approved?
I think being a Commission official, it's always hard to speculate. So it's up in the hands of the political leaders. But I think one of the ongoing discussions where we hopefully get some clear clarifications, also a question that popped up in the chat around what is actually strategic technology. And that's one of the question, what should we do with the limited means that are available on the European side? I think that's one of the questions that is cutting across the board of the clean energy climate transition that we have in mind. So what should we put the means that we have on one technology or the other? And I think in the past Commission was a strong promoter of technology neutrality, but we've seen that it's maybe led to many different routes to go forward, but maybe on the expense of not really focusing on the most promising ones. What the Net Zero Industry Act proposal included was a short list of those technologies that might be the most influential until 2030. And the ongoing negotiations between the European Parliament, Commission, and Member States are addressing those issues. What are we able to focus on a limited set of technologies, on the benefits that we could benefit them more, by giving them priority, or are we still including a long list of technologies on the expense that there's limited funds for some technologies that could be the most influential? I think this is a very crucial question also for the next round of debates. What are we able to prioritize, or do we follow up on technology neutrality like in the past? And with the Net Zero Industry Act, we are opened up a complete new discussion where we are moving away from deployment targets. When you've seen that we mostly focused on the gigawatt installed in Europe, but now the idea is also where actually they are manufactured. How is our industrial base? I think this is opening a complete new dimension on climate and energy targets, and I think this is the first step where our leaders will basically build upon in the next mandate.
Great. Perhaps last micro statements by Johanna and Angel. What would be your wish or your ask to the new Commission that will start in September this year? Johanna?
Sure. I already noted these in my opening remarks, but I think two rich areas for further movement on to industrial policy are very much around building green lead markets in Europe. So really using that single market to power to send that signal of these are the green products and services that we're prioritizing and how we take that forward. We've done that to some extent with CBAM at our borders, but also really having that market pull within Europe is really crucial. And there have been steps on this with eco-design, but taking this forward with green public procurement and the signal sent there. And the second element really is around electricity market reform. There's a huge amount of potential for industrial electrification in Europe that has yet to be seized. So really putting together a package of measures that incentivize that electrification, that make it a feasible option for transitioning a huge part of EU industry, and then really capturing that element of let's really green our power system, make that the cornerstone of industrial competitiveness by making it cheap, green, and abundant in a way that is harder to do in other parts of the world. I think that's a real element of competitiveness that we haven't quite managed to capture yet.
Angel, over to you. What would you
So
ask?
thank you. In order to have a European sitting in the table with the Chinese, the American, and the Indians, we need a real unique market. That means also in terms of financial capital markets union. We need to make the energy transition as cheap as possible. We need to make it efficient, and that means let's technologies compete, let companies compete, let consumers and companies let treat people as adults, and let them choose the most efficient solution to decarbonize, and not the one the politicians need. And in that manner, we will go faster and cheaper. Having said that, I believe we are moving in the right direction. My worry is if we're going to move fast enough, but let's see how things evolve. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Angel, thank you very much. Karsten, thank you for your time. And Johanna, this has been a great conversation, a lot to think and talk about. And I'm sure we'll cross paths again soon to talk about these fascinating and crucial policies and matters. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
And thank you all for assisting to this webinar. We will be posting the webinar on our webpage and an open room as well as the policy brief. Thank you all.